Glember, The Tale of a Monster. Written, recorded, and illustrated by A.K. Brookman. Chapter VII, The Recurring Storm, continued. Day 22. The dream returned that night, this time more clearly. It was storming. I think most of the lessons of life come with a storm. I couldn't see well, as we seldom can until the storm is done. Glember was yelling something from above, while the rain fell heavily around us. It was so cold and dreary. It was as though fog, too thick to breathe or see well through, settled down around us. Glember lifted something up over his head. What was happening, I wondered. What had happened to me? I was in a great deal of pain, especially my side. My face felt swollen and stiff, and, as I touched it, I winced in pain. I couldn't open one of my eyes all the way due to the swelling, nor could I hear well. However, I could hear Glember yelling again. The man was hollering something back at Glember in reply. Glember seemed as though he didn't know what to do. And then, he threw the man over the ledge. I think he was screaming a loud, terrified scream that died as he descended. That morning, I sat there motionless for a while, trying to make sense of the dream. I'd heard of recurring dreams, but I never before had one. I was certain that it was no dream now. I was convinced that I was remembering what happened while I was taken by the poison. And yet, as studiously as I worked to recall more, I could not. It was as though the subsiding storm of my dreams would render no secrets. Perhaps I would never know what had happened during those lost days. The waters had again dropped. Indeed, this day there was more land to be seen than waters. I was thankful for that at least. I stretched. Oddly, the surrounding waters lent not their moisture to me as they did the earth. My lips had cracked in the night, and I could taste blood as I ran my tongue over them. My throat was dry, and my body ached. The previous day, I had mapped out the path I would take in an attempt to head south back toward my home. Now, everything looked different. The retracting waters created a new landscape, one difficult to make out. I could only guess now which places were higher than others. The plot of land I stood on had grown tenfold in the night. As I began making my way, I found at the bank of it a fall that plummeted more than I had noticed the day before. I began making my way around it when, as if in response to my intrigue, it let loose a great explosion of bubbling air. It ended as quickly as it began, and I was left waiting for the waters to calm, to make out the shimmering view below the water. There was a passage. It burrowed into the earth beneath the surface. I looked around, both far and near, in all directions. It was as though I wanted to ask someone or something if I indeed was seeing what I thought I saw. There was something ominous about it, and that was when I remembered Glember's words. How had I forgotten them until now? Of course I knew how. He said it when we were up to our waists in snakes. My fears were given greater attention than Glember's words then, and yet I could hear them echo now in my head. When we get across, Glember said, we will find the highest ground, and beside it will be the lowest ground. Well, that's all I could remember. Doubtless, we had certainly found the highest ground in the area. It was the only place from the distant mountains in the west to the distant mountains in the east that was not covered by water when the flood was at its highest. Was this, then, the lowest ground he spoke of? I peered skeptically into the depths. South of where I stood, I could make out a passage of the river as it reached out east and west, eventually turning south in the west and more northerly in the east. It was mostly flooded over, and yet I could now recall the path Glember and I took as we reached its bank and climbed to where we found our high ground. I was convinced now that it was where Glember was headed, where he was taking me. I cannot explain why, but I felt compelled to go there, the way a child feels drawn to something wrong for little more than sake of defiance. And yet, who was I defying? Why was it wrong? In this case, it was intrigue alone calling, baiting me. No trees yet stood around me but one. What few animals or plants I may find were submerged for 2 days. I'd not find dry wood for the kindling of fire. I was likely going to starve to death anyway. I doubted my strength would yet permit me the travel needed to reach safety or food in the south. I looked back into the depths. I could make out now the way the earth spiraled downward in a series of ledges until it reached the tunnel. I watched as another great bubble of air escaped the tunnel, floating rapidly up in a silvery globe until it burst at the surface before me. Although I knew it would sound, it yet startled me. It forced me to gaze about as if something was suddenly descending upon me. Only floating trees, dead swollen snakes, and patches of water waited for my eyes. Perhaps I could eat one of the snakes. Would the venom kill me as it had Glember? And why wasn't Glember floating or lying somewhere for that matter? I didn't know the answer to any of these questions. I'd learned to live off the land, but this was no forest or field. It was a drowned wasteland. I looked again to the depths. I could wait for another day for the water to recede. It was doing so rapidly for reasons I could not comprehend. I stood there a while considering. And then I did something that yet surprises even me. I dove into the waters and began to swim toward the passage in the depths. Chapter VIII. What lay hidden beneath the surface. Day 23. The dream came again. Each time it offered more, unfolding, bidding me recall. It was storming again. I think most of the lessons of life come with a storm. I couldn't see well, as we seldom can until the storm is done. Glember was yelling something from above, while the rain fell heavily around us. In the distance, one of the wizards was fleeing, I saw, as lightning flashed across the sky. His lower jaw had been ripped off, and he had no longer the desire to remain with his companion. I was both cold and dreary, as though I had been drugged. My chest protested in pain with each inhalation, as though fog too thick to breathe or see well through settled down around us. I had been beaten nearly to death, I realized. Glember lifted the other wizard up over his head. What was happening, I wondered? What had happened to me? I was in a great deal of pain, especially my side. My face felt swollen and stiff as I touched it. I winced at how tender its surface was. I couldn't open one of my eyes all the way due to swelling, nor could I hear well. However, I could hear Glember yelling again. The wizard was yelling back at Glember in reply. "We will save the human! We will save him!" Glember seemed as though he didn't know what to do, and then he threw the wizard over the ledge. I think the wizard was screaming a loud, terrified scream that died as he descended. On the 23rd day, I woke feeling somewhat restored. I'd slept well in the comfortable cavern. It was neither cold nor hot, but just as I would have it. A bed of glowflowers made the coarse floor bearable, and the odd winds that circulated through the chamber, entered here and there from adjoining chambers, had sufficiently dried my clothes in the night. Neither was I hungry. My father taught me long ago that glowflowers were edible. I strained water through several layers of their leaves before drinking. That I learned from a man in town who I enjoyed speaking with on those days I went to market to trade. The tunnel underwater led to this massive chamber. There were 13 pools in my new home, and it seemed free of the corruption above. I was confident that the water level here would not rise, for there was no way for air to escape above. The tunnel, of course, entered the room through the ground. Even the constitution of the air seemed pure and free of the taint I sensed near the banks above, where now only lifeless snakes lay bloated in their deathbeds. Neither dead nor asleep any longer myself, I knew I owed it to pain that I was here. I couldn't have walked long in those barren, flooded lands, and, being here to a sense of freedom, I felt renewed. The great pillars holding this cavern intact were as impressive as they were beautiful, and it seemed that any being could benefit from this atmosphere. However, I was not to remain long here. I planned to return home to my family as soon as the waters above receded enough to permit a safe passage. The stars above would guide me well enough, I knew, and despite the rugged and hostile terrain Glember and I crossed, this refuge offered me the belief I could make it, regardless of how far I would have to roam. Still shaking from the fading dream that morning, I couldn't help wonder what had happened to the wizards of Nye. I suppose they tried their best to rescue me, and suffered at Glember's hands because of it. It was their creed that stayed them, no matter the danger, I was often told. In the towns, these heroes were often celebrated. I was not one to drink, but remember a time when I celebrated my brother's birthday at the tavern in town. There was an old plaque in the corner of the tavern that called my attention. It read, "Hail the Wizards of Nye, N-I-G-H. I thought that odd. Were they not called the Wizards of Nye, G-N-A-I? I asked my brother. A regular in the tavern heard me and wandered near. He said the order had changed its name long ago. In fact, he said, they had changed it many a time. Before that, it was the Nye Wizard Order, he said with a grin. He seemed to be an historian of some kind. Said he tracked the order's history for years until he lost everything following it. At that point, my brother whispered that I should quit talking to him, assured me that the man was insane. The man didn't seem to want to talk any further anyway. Such history nonetheless, and I couldn't help feel guilty for the two that tried to save me. Glember was harsh with them, it seemed, and I wanted to remember the entirety of those days, for I had suffered at Glember's hands just as they had, while I had little memory of it in return for my troubles. Oddly, it was as I was thinking about suffering at his hands that I found a distinct impression in the dusty floor before me in that great cavern. It was Glember's hand. I knew it the moment I saw it. My eyes darted around the chamber, scrutinizing each shadow, each pull for movement. The chamber was still and quiet. There was no sign of him, other than that impression, that is. I bent 2 of my fingers inward and placed them over the print. It was his claw that made the impression. I was sure of it. Glember was alive. Day 24. The thought had never crossed my mind that Glember could have wandered through this place a dozen years ago, and his handprint would yet remain undisturbed. In recollection, we can always laugh at our immediate thoughts. We can easily be convinced of anything, despite the opposite being true. Likely this echoes beyond this tale. You should forgive me for my haste in such situations. I had been through much in the past 20-some days. Yet, let us continue. There is something to be said of the diligence and the patience of the farmer. I don't think a clockmaker has as keen an understanding of time as a farmer. A farmer may have little idea of the outcome of his work until the following year, while a clockmaker may sell his time by the day. I waited a day in that cave, hiding in a crevice, peeking out and across the chamber. Nothing stirred. No sound came to greet my ear. No visitor entered from one of the many tunnels burrowing out into the darkness from the chamber, and the only thing I took from it was patience. Not that I waited patiently. Time drudged on. I kept thinking about my family, and how they must be so torn, wondering what had become of me. I don't want to talk long about this. It saddens me still. A young glowflower bud nearby opened slowly as I waited. Its light at first escaped only through a tiny hole, reaching out for the roof of the cavern where it placed its tiny mark. I watched that light grow. As the petals bent back, I was struck by its beauty, and while the ceiling was entertaining to watch, it was not what was illuminated there that was of any worth, but the beauty of the flower, of the nature that came before. I wondered what Glember was like in the past. I wondered what he was like as a child, before he turned into this monster, before he hated the freedom of men. It was nearing the end of the day by then. I had planned to swim to the surface to check the southern reaches. If they were dry enough, I could pack up some of the glowflowers for food and begin my journey back home. Yet I was getting tired again. I decided I would wait for morning. After all, swimming down here was easy compared with what I imagined swimming back up would be. The contraption on my back not only increased my weight and inability to float, it also made swimming very inefficient, if not impossible. I could hardly move my arms. No, I'd wait for morning. I wanted another good night's sleep before the difficult trek home. I made my hidden nook as comfortable as I could and began to drift off to sleep. I woke many times that night, lifting my head to study the chamber a time, until I was content it remained empty. I was not entirely asleep this time when the dream came. It was more of a memory, a recollection, for I could have opened my eyes at any moment, or stretched out, or sat up. I did nothing of the sort, for fear it would shatter the images and sounds. Each time I was remembering a little more. It was storming again. I think most of the lessons of life come with a storm. I couldn't see well, as we seldom can until the storm is done. Glember was standing over me, breathing heavily, his hands dripping with blood. One of the wizards managed to get to his feet, blood pouring out through his fingers that covered his mouth and chin. He took only a brief, horrified look at Glember before he staggered backward and away from the gargoyle. "Get back!" the second wizard was yelling. The storm was so loud that I could hardly make it out at all. I think he was telling Glember to get back, trying to protect me from further harm. "Get back, or I'll kill you myself," the wizard finished. There was a sudden movement and chaos of a skirmish. I managed to sit up and lean against a large boulder behind me. Glember was yelling something from above while the rain fell heavily around us. In the distance, the bloodied wizard was fleeing, I saw, as lightning flashed across the sky. His lower jaw had been ripped off, and he had no longer the desire to remain with his companion. I was both cold and dreary, as though I had been drugged. My chest protested in pain with each inhalation, as though fog too thick to breathe or see well through settled down around us. I had been beaten nearly to death, I realized. Glember lifted the other wizard up over his head. What was happening, I wondered? What had happened to me? I was in a great deal of pain, especially my side. My face felt swollen and stiff. As I touched it, I winced at how tender its surface was. I couldn't open one of my eyes all the way due to the swelling, nor could I hear well. However, I could hear Glember yelling again. The wizard was yelling back at Glember in reply. "We will save the human. We will save him." Glember seemed as though he didn't know what to do. The wizard was speaking more softly now, but it was of no avail. For then Glember threw the wizard over the ledge. I think the wizard was screaming a loud, terrified scream that died as he descended. I think that was the extent of the memory. They stood no chance against Glember. The monster tore them both apart. I don't suppose a wizard can chant well without the use of his lower jaw, nor when hurled to a death for that matter. I shifted to pull a piece of rock out from under me. "Damn gargle," I hissed as I did so. "Oh, really?" I heard. A shudder moved through my entire body as fear seized me. It was his voice. I was crawling away and turning about at the same time, yet I could crawl nowhere. Met with the rocky wall of my crevice. When I turned about, Glember loomed over me, his claws hanging down not far from my face. I had never fainted with fear before in my life. I thought it was something that happened to women alone, but I must have, for that is all I remember. I remember panic and nothing more. This concludes part 6 of 17 of Glember, The Tale of a Monster. You're listening to the first book of the Meristherian Trilogy. Please subscribe if you like the content, where you'll have access to additional books. Feel free to support this channel by telling others about it. These books are free to listen to, as you know, and everyone's welcome here. Leave a friendly comment if you like. Again, this is AK. Thanks for listening, friends, and see you next time.